there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books, and today we're here to do a late June wrap up. So I know that we're already through July and I still haven't wrapped up June, but I read so many fabulous books in June that I wanted to make sure that I shot this video and told you about them anyways. So that's what we're gonna do today. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. In June, I read a total of 23 books. That breaks down to 6,287 pages, and the page average per book was 273. My top 5 genres in June were literary fiction, horror, historical fiction, fantasy, and short stories. My longest read of the month was The Fallen Fruit by Shawntelle Madison at 438 pages. My shortest read of the month was Feed Them Silence by Lee Mandello, which was at 105 pages. So now with the stats out of the way, we're gonna go ahead and talk about how I felt about each book. I'm gonna start with my 2 stars and work my way up to the 5 stars. And I had some really fantastic 5 stars, so you definitely want to stick around for that part. Before we get into that though, if you could do me a favor and hit the like button and comment down below and let me know, how was your reading month in June? Did you find some really good books? Were you disappointed in anything that you read? Tell me all of the things. So jumping into my 2-star reads, we're gonna start with The Fallen Fruit by Shawntelle Madison. This is a book that I got through NetGalley as an ARC, and it is publishing in September, I believe. This is a book that sounded really good to me. It was kind of giving me Kindred by Octavia Butler vibes. It has that element of time travel with that historical element mixed in. It sounded like it was going to be such a powerful and interesting read. Unfortunately, this just did not work out. We have this family where certain members of the family get launched back into the past, and you don't know who it's going to be. So our book starts by following a brother and a sister, and they have all these preparations in place in case one of them gets launched back. And the brother gets sent back into the past and the sister remains in the present. Then we never see any more time travel after that. Basically, it's about her going to school and her doing a bunch of normal things, and it just dragged on and on and on, and I thought it was going to be this exciting action-packed book, and I just found myself having a really hard time caring about it, unfortunately. Concept was cool, but I just feel like the execution wasn't quite right. My second 2-star read was Alice, Sadie, and Celine by Sarah Blakely-Cartwright. So this is a book that I got knowing that I might not like it, which sounds strange. It was like one of those books where the subject matter could either be handled really well and be excellent, or handled not very well and then be terrible. And unfortunately, I'm leaning on the side of it not being that good. So we have 3 characters, Alice, Sadie, and Celine. 2 of them are friends and one of them is the mom. And the mother starts an affair with her daughter's best friend. And honestly, the reason for them to start this affair is so weak. There's just a lot about it that I didn't enjoy. This book comes in at under 250 pages. And for me, it felt rushed the whole way through. I never felt like I really emotionally connected with any of the characters. And I feel like that's because there's so few pages. Maybe if the author had written a little bit more, taken a little bit more time to delve into the emotional complexity of the situation, it would have been a better book. Now we're jumping into my 3 stars. So the first of my 3 stars was Manhunt by Gretchen Felker-Martin. Now I want to say up front that this is probably on the higher end of the 3 stars. It was close to a 4-star. There were a lot of things that I really liked in this book. I thought that the post-apocalyptic setting was really good. This idea of a virus that only affects men. We're following trans characters as they try to dodge feral men who have contracted this virus that turns them into like rabid zombies. And they're also attempting to dodge bans of trans radical exclusionary feminists. I thought it was really funny in parts. Like there were definitely bits of humor. It was like really dark humor, but I really appreciated that. I was very engrossed in the story. I thought it read really well. At the end of the day, I think I wanted a little less gore in some places and a little bit more detail in others. I thought that overall this was a really good concept, and especially if you're really into like gore, body horror, zombies, things like that, you will probably really enjoy this book. Then I have Eartheater or Cometiera by Dolores Reyes. So this is a book that I read for a translated fiction book club on Scott or Gunpowder Fiction Plots Patreon channel. I was really excited. So I have been really loving Argentinian translated fiction, and this is an Argentinian author. I've just been on a streak with it, and so I was hoping that this would continue that streak. Unfortunately, this book for me just didn't quite work all of the way. I think some of it may have come down to some translation issues. I originally read this in English because that was what was readily available at my local library. But upon searching on Libby, I was able to find the ebook in Spanish at the San Diego County Library. And so I read it in English kind of feeling like something was missing, like maybe I wasn't getting everything the author was trying to say. There were some words that were translated in very strange ways, colloquialisms and things like that, that just weren't making sense in English. And then when I started reading it in Spanish, it made more sense. And it was just that probably the translator wasn't quite sure how to translate the Argentinian slang, because I found that some of the things that were confusing for me made more sense in Spanish. That said, I still didn't love this book. I felt like it was a little bit rushed. This is, again, a really short book, and I felt like it could have used like another 100 pages. We have a main character who literally eats dirt, and when she eats dirt, she connects with like women who have been murdered, and people are coming to her for her talent to try to help with cases. It sounds like a really interesting concept, and I feel like there's a lot that could have been done with it. It did have a few good moments where it talked about economic disparity and gender violence, but I felt like it didn't dig into those themes deep enough. It was a little bit more superficial and shallow when it could have really said some very poignant things. This was just one of those books that was frustrating because it had the bones to be something great, and it just ended up being okay. Next up, I have The Jinn Daughter by Rania Hanna. So this was a book that I was gifted by the author in exchange for an honest review, and I was really excited to delve into this. I love books that feature Middle Eastern folklore, and so just by the title alone, I knew I was going to be interested in this. So this book follows a character who is a Hakawati jinn. Her name is Nadine, and her job is to eat pomegranate seeds, which are representative of souls of recently dead people. And then in that process of eating the seeds, she tells their stories, and they are released to travel to the afterlife. Sounds like a pretty good concept. I was especially excited about like every time she eats a pomegranate seed, she tells somebody's story, and that kind of reconnected into that Middle Eastern folklore. Unfortunately, this was a case of too many things packed into too short of a book. You can see that this is not very long. It's only 265 pages, and this suffered because I feel like this author tried to put every single idea that she had into one book. Unfortunately, there were several major plot points within this book that had absolutely nothing to do with the resolution of the story, that were like jammed in for no reason at all. I was also a bit frustrated by the character's snap mind changes. One moment she would be like, I would never ever do this thing, and then literally on the next page she would be doing the thing that she said she would never ever do. I had a hard time believing the character, I had a hard time trusting the character, and honestly, I felt like I had a whiplash going back and forth between all of the different things that were happening. This book probably needed another 150 pages to really do the story justice. I felt invested in aspects of the story, especially her relationship with her husband and her daughter, but there were just too many other things that were shoehorned into this book. Then I read Oye by Melissa Mongollon. So this book follows a Colombian family in Florida. There is a hurricane about to hit. Mother and daughter are fleeing, and they're trying to get grandma to flee with them, but grandma refuses to go. She will not be chased out of her home by any hurricane. She has survived them all, and she's gonna survive this one too. The aftermath of the hurricane leaves the family scrambling to care for grandma and to heal some of the trauma within the different family dynamics. First of all, let me give the story props in that it tells the story in a very unique way. The main character is telling the story like she's talking on the phone with her sister. So everything is in like these little short chapters where she's like filling her sister in on what's going on and asking her why she's not coming out to visit. That's really a cool technique. However, it gets a little bit frustrating as the story continues. I feel like it was cool for like 10, 15, 20 pages. And then after a while, I was like, this is kind of annoying just hearing this, like she's talking on the phone. I wanted to hear what the sister was saying. I wanted to hear the other side of the story. So I don't know if the format was entirely successful for me. I did really appreciate some of the family dynamics, and I thought that some of the cultural elements were handled really well. I don't know if I loved all of it. I think at some points the story felt a little overdramatic, but overall I thought it was a solid read. I would consider reading a book by Mongollon again, but I feel like I could tell that this was a debut. And the last of my 3-star reads is Please Miss, a heartbreaking work of staggering penis by Grace Lavery. So this is a memoir, and it's very rare that I will rate a memoir outside of 4 or 5 stars, just because it's somebody's individual story, and I feel like that's a hard thing to judge. So I am not judging Lavery's story here. That is their story, and that's not up to me to give an opinion on. But I did feel some disconnect with this memoir. I found it a little bit chaotic. Clearly, Grace is a very interesting person and a very smart person. She's an associate professor of English at UC Berkeley. She is an intellectual and an activist, many admirable things. I struggled with the connection in this memoir, and for me, a connection with a memoir is really important. I don't necessarily have to relate, but I have to understand or feel connected. This was so all over the place that I had a hard time connecting. All in all, this was an interesting read, and I'm glad that I picked this book up. This was one that I was sent by Seal Press actually quite a while back. So I'm glad to have finally gotten to it. Now we're gonna talk 4 stars. My first 4-star read is Hijab Butch Blues by Lamya H. So this is a memoir that follows Lamya as she tries to find a balance between her religious beliefs and her sexual identity. Lamya is pretty devoutly Muslim, and as she realizes that she is gay, she struggles to find her place within the church and to find representation. She relates a lot back to different religious stories that she's read in the Quran, and she frequently discusses gender identity and sexual identity and things like that throughout her religious upbringing. It's really interesting because a lot of times when I have read stories about queer Muslim people, they're usually having a break from their religion because of intolerance or inability to reconcile who they are with their religious beliefs. But it's actually the opposite for Lamya. She seems to find solace in the religious stories that she grew up with. And while the church isn't entirely accepting of who she is, she does eventually find her group of people. And I just thought that was really lovely. I really appreciated that this was such a vastly different perspective than what I have seen in the past. So definitely would recommend this if you're into memoirs. Then for June on the Range, I read Valentine by Elizabeth Wetmore. This is a book that I have had on my shelf for quite a while and have been meaning to get to, and it just kind of keeps getting pushed off for other things that seem more interesting. But I'm so glad that I picked this up because it ended up being a really good read. This is set in the 1970s in Odessa, Texas. There's an oil boom. We have this family who's living out on this lonely, isolated ranch. And the husband is out at work for the day, and mom is at home with her child, and this young Mexican woman comes and bangs on her door. She's been violently and brutally attacked, and so without thought, the owner of the home shepherds her inside, locks the door, and grabs her gun just in time to see a cloud of dust traveling down the road towards their home. A few minutes later, a gentleman jumps out of the truck and claims that he's looking for his girlfriend, that they've had a fight, and that he knows that she's inside the house, and will she just let him get her and he'll be on his way. But Mama holds her ground. She aims a gun at him and tells him to get lost. Luckily, the police show up in time to prevent any bloodshed, but it does trigger a whole chain of events, and that is what this book follows. This book was brutal. There were parts that were so hard to read. It does not shy away from talking about women's issues. It does not shy away from talking about racism and xenophobia. It, in general, was really thematically rich and deep, and it was surprisingly a book that I enjoyed a lot more than I expected. I'm not super into Westerns or these little country towns. I kind of was dragging my feet getting into this, and I ended up really, really enjoying this. As much as you could enjoy a book that is about such difficult subject matter. Next up, I have Goddess of the River by Vaishnavi Patel. This is a book I was really looking forward to. I absolutely loved their previous book, Kaikeyi, which you can see on my display over here. So Goddess of the River follows a character who is in fact the goddess of the river Ganga. Through a series of events, she is stripped of her god powers. She ends up marrying the king of a local municipality, and he is just enthralled with her, but he doesn't realize that she's a goddess, and he doesn't know that there's anything special going on. In order to have her god status returned, she has to sacrifice 8 children. And so she is constantly getting pregnant and then having issues with the pregnancies. And her husband at first just thinks she's unlucky, that she's having fertility issues. He's very understanding. But as they lose more and more children, things start to turn. She figures that eventually she's gonna give him 1 child to be the heir to his throne after she's given up her 8 sacrifices. But things get really complicated, and it sets off a grand series of events that erupt into a war. I thought this book was really interesting. There was a lot going on. This is not a story that I was familiar with prior to this book. I thought our main character was probably the best part of the book. We were in her head throughout it, and I could really understand her and where she was coming from, the choices that she made. It was just beautifully written in that way. This is a really big story to tell though, and I felt like certain parts of the book dragged a little bit for me. Maybe they got bogged down a little bit in too much detail, but overall I found it to be a really interesting story. Not quite as good as Kai-Kei, but still a solid read. If you enjoyed Kai-Kei, you will probably like this one. And then I had The Cemetery of Untold Stories by Julia Alvarez. So this is a book about a young woman who is working in a cemetery in the Dominican Republic. But the cemetery is special in that it is different characters that are buried instead of actual people. And so as she goes about her business in the cemetery on a day-to-day basis, she finds that if she listens closely, she'll hear these people's stories being told. She also has an estranged sister who's here in the United States with her husband and children. And her sister is actually on trial for murder after catching her philandering husband trying to leave her. The stories intersect and they make for a really interesting read. I have read Alvarez's work before, and I think that this is actually my favorite book of hers so far. There were moments that I wish had been a little clearer or a little bit more detailed, but overall I found this to be a really interesting and enjoyable read, and I was really interested in the concept of the cemetery. Next up, I have My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Otessa Moshfegh. This was the book that we read for our first episode of the Backlist Book Club. And I wasn't sure how I was going to feel about this. My mom read this a few months back and didn't really enjoy it that much, but I thought I would give it a try anyways, because every once in a while we differ in opinion. And this happens to be a book that we differ in opinion on. So this book follows a young woman who is experiencing extreme depression. The thing is she is very privileged. She is wealthy. She can just quit her job and sulk. She is supposedly good looking, physically in good condition. She's just stuck in this mental rut. And she's really hard to empathize with because she treats everybody like crap. She is honestly a pretty terrible person. And I think that's really intentional on Moshfegh's part. I feel like Moshfegh wanted her to be a hard character to empathize with. I felt like there was some kind of commentary on how it's easy to empathize for certain people and really hard to practice empathy for others. I actually found this to be a really compelling read. I was very interested to see where it was going, and the ending in particular really had me shook. I won't say any more than that, but if you've read it, please let me know what you thought of the ending. Overall, I thought this was pretty good. There were a few things that I might change, but there was nothing catastrophic that really made me hate reading this. My next 4-star read is Homesick by Nino. This is a book that was recommended to me in December when I went home to San Diego and we were doing some book shopping. I went into Mysterious Galaxy and the young lady that was working there said that this was one of her favorite short story collections. I have been on a short story spree lately. I've read one good short story collection after another, and so I was really excited to get this recommendation. And I'm glad that I picked this up because this does some really interesting structural things. This book foregrounds a lot of queer relationships and focuses a lot on transgender and non-binary identities. So I really appreciated that thematic exploration. I also really appreciated that this author did a lot of really different things. Some of the stories were told in really unique ways. There was one story that was told in the format of a quiz. There was one story that was told as an interview. There's just a lot going on, and it made this more interesting than just the typical short story collection. Now, there were 2 stories in this book that I just really didn't care for and really didn't get, but overall, that's pretty typical with short stories. You're not always gonna like every single story in the collection, as long as the overwhelming feeling is that they were good, and that's the case here. With all the horror and heavy reads on this TBR, I wanted something that was a little bit light, a little bit cozy, a little bit fuzzy. So I picked up The Guncle Abroad by Stephen Rowley. So I read The Guncle, I want to say last year, and really enjoyed it. It was such a fun book and I just fell in love with the characters. So when I saw that there was a second book coming out, I was so excited. For me, The Guncle Abroad was still really good. There still are characters whom we love. There's still overwhelmingly a light feel to the book, but this definitely had some more emotionally complex subject matter. And I didn't find it quite as light and fluffy as the first one. Not that the first one didn't deal with some difficult issues too, but it just didn't feel quite as heavy for me. But all in all, this was still a lot of fun. If you're looking for something that's a little bit lighter, a little bit easier, I would definitely recommend this, especially if you liked the first book. And then I picked up Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt. So this is a book that I've heard a lot about, and it seems to be very polarizing. Some people seem to really love it, and some people don't really like it at all. I was very curious to see where I would fall. This is a book that, to me, I feel like I didn't necessarily get everything out of it. I'm sure that there are some things that went over my head because it feels like a really smart book and like maybe I just didn't grasp everything. But what I did grasp, I found super interesting. This is a multi-POV horror story that flashes from the present to the past. And so our main characters are this haunted house, a trans woman, and a TERF. And the woman who is a TERF is the ex-girlfriend of the trans woman. So things are really complicated. Both of our main characters claim that the other person sexually assaulted them. And it all goes back to this visit to this haunted house. I wasn't sure how all of this was gonna come together. Like the first half of the book, I was like, what is going on? I'm not sure that I get everything. And then pieces kind of start to snap into place. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, I get it now. And it was really fascinating. It talks a lot about fascism and hatred and how those sentiments brew in a population. And I thought this offered some really fascinating insight into that subject. This book offers some really gruesome scenes as well. There was one in particular that like, oh, I was just cringing. I had such a hard time reading it. But I feel like it really adds to the effect of what this author is trying to say. I know I've seen a couple reviews of people saying that they didn't feel like this was really a horror book. And I'm not sure what book they read because there was a ton of horror in this. There was a lot of body horror, a lot of gore, and then there was also like horrifying ideas and the way that they kind of spin out of control. For me, there was a lot that was actually genuinely terrifying in this book. And I found it really interesting how the author handled all of these different topics. I think the only thing that kept this from being a 5-star for me is that there were times that it was a little bit hard to follow because we have our two main characters plus the POV of this haunted house, and we're in the present and then we're in the past, and it kind of shifts around. It made it a little bit challenging to keep up with at all times. It wasn't like a fluid, smooth read, but I did really feel like it paid off in the end. And I found a lot of meaning in this book. I thought this was a pretty well done book. Next in my 4-star reads was Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. This follows a young indigiqueer man who works as a sex worker as he tries to accrue the funds to get home to his stepfather's funeral. This was a short book, but it was really emotionally impactful. The writing in this was really smooth, and it's a pretty quick read. It's not a long book. This went to some really emotionally deep places and talked about some really important themes. I will say that at points the story dragged a little bit for me, but overall I found it to be a really interesting read. And the last of my 4-star reads is Feed Them Silence by Lee Mandello. This is a queer horror novella following a woman who is a scientist. She is studying wolves, and she has a piece of technology that allows her to like neurolink with the wolf pack. She becomes very obsessive and a little bit too close to her work, and that leads to some startling consequences. So I really liked this book. I thought that it had kind of this creeping sense of dread throughout. It's not like overt horror, it's more just kind of something that's a little bit creepy. And I thought that this dealt with relationship dynamics really well as well. You're kind of seeing the end of a relationship and how it just slowly falls apart. I thought that that was captured excellently. My biggest critique of this book is that it was just too short. I wanted more of the wolf experiments, I wanted more of the relationship, just wanted more story in general. Now we're gonna jump into my 5-star reads. First up, we're gonna be talking about Poverty by America by Mathew. This is a book that discusses poverty in America. It goes into depth into the causes of poverty, how people are kept in these impoverished structures, all sorts of different really deep and interesting themes. This is clearly a really well-researched and well-written book, and it is getting a ton of praise for a very solid reason. I am just here to add on that I also think it's a 5-star read along with pretty much everyone else. If you're interested in social justice, if you're interested in social inequity, if you're interested in economics in general, I think that this is a book that you should definitely read. Next up in the 5-star category is Her Body and Other Parties by Carmen Machado. This is Machado's short story collection, and this was fantastic. I have heard nothing but rave reviews about this particular short story collection, and now I know why. This is also another book that does some experimental things in terms of structure. In particular, there's a story in here that is called Especially Heinous that is basically featuring Benson and Stabler from Law & Order SVU. And it's these little like micro stories, and it just goes on and on and on. It tells this like long story via these little vignettes. And so I thought that was particularly interesting. This talks a lot about women and violations of the female body. And I thought this was just beautifully written. Machado clearly has a knack for prose, and that shines in this book. Next up, I have Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle. This is a book that I got through NetGalley as an ARC. I'd never read Chuck Tingle before. I had never actually even heard of him. I was unaware that he had any other books, but the cover of this book was so bright and eye-catching, and I read the summary and I was like, oh my gosh, this sounds amazing. So this book follows a main character who is working in Hollywood as a screenwriter, and he's working on this series, and he's just the point where like he's getting to the end of the season, and the two main female leads are about to get into a relationship with each other. And then studio execs come to him and are basically like, hey, sorry, but we can't have a gay couple on TV. It'll do better with the audience if you kill them both off. Our main character is heartbroken. He's tired of the years of queer baiting in Hollywood, and he really wants the characters to have this gay relationship. But the Hollywood execs are just like, no, absolutely not. You have to kill them off or we'll do it for you. And while he's thinking about it, all of a sudden he starts being like haunted and attacked by different villains from his previous movies and TV shows. This book was so interesting. So first of all, this was like a combination of a thriller and horror. I was on the edge of my seat throughout the entirety of this book. The horror elements were fantastically done. There was so much suspense. And the thing that I loved about all of it is like, while it could feel a little bit campy at points, there was always these like really deep thematic discussions going on throughout this book. It was critical. It had something to say. I just thought that this book was brilliantly done. I, in fact, liked this book so much that I went and looked Chuck Tingle up and found out that he has a previous horror novel called Camp Damascus, and I immediately requested it on Libby. I really want to get into that now, and I will say that I am definitely going to read Tingle's next novel. After that, I had Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. So this is a book that's been on my TBR for a while. I picked it up for Read Historical Fiction 2024 that was hosted by Shelley-ish, and this was for historical fiction set in another country. So this is not so much a novel as a series of interconnected short stories, and it starts in Ghana, and we have two siblings, one who is enslaved and one who marries a white man and essentially lives in a palace and is treated like a princess. And then we see stories of that family's lineage, like from that point forward. I love the way that Gyasi structured this and shows like this huge passage of time, and then really the effects of slavery on the family for generations to come. This was definitely really moving, really emotional. If you're a fan of historical fiction, this is, I feel like, a must read. I am so glad that this ended up being good because I've heard so many rave reviews of it, and I was just worried that in my head it would be too overhyped, but it definitely lived up to its reputation. Then I had In the Dream House by Carmen Machado. Okay, so it's not often that I read two books by the same author in the same month, but it's especially even more common that both of those books would be 5-star reads. But that is the case here. This is Machado's memoir of an abusive relationship that she suffered through. And this is just like, damn. I don't know what else to say. I was reading this and it's like that juxtaposition of gorgeous prose and just horrific content, but it's so brilliantly handled. Everything is like 1 page to 2 pages in terms of chapter length, so the story moves really fast. I thought that the titling was really cool too. So like every single chapter starts with Dream House as. So Dream House as world building, Dream House as set design, Dream House as cosmic horror, Dream House as shipwreck. It just was really, really creatively structured. And then the writing was absolutely stunning. The thing that I found especially appealing about this book is that Machado writes about this really clearly dysfunctional, messed up relationship where she is very clearly being abused, but she doesn't write about it only in a negative way. Like, she writes about it and there's still like hope and love and like all these conflicting emotions, and that's what makes it so poignant. You can really see how she got sucked into this toxic relationship and what it really did to her. And I really appreciated the author's note at the end talking about how there just aren't that many memoirs of queer abusive relationships and why she decided to write this book. This was an excellent read. And my final 5-star read was Fat Ham by James E. James. So this was a book that really surprised me. This is a young, queer, Black Southern retelling of Hamlet. And I didn't know if I was gonna like this or not. This was a book that was recommended to me at Libellula Books in San Diego, and they usually give great recommendations there. So I was like, you know what? This doesn't seem like something I would typically pick up, but I'm gonna go ahead and trust you, and I'm glad I did. I don't usually like reading books that are told in play format just because I miss the descriptive element, but this story actually really works well as a play, and I was surprised. I found this like more humorous than I was expecting. The like setting of it, I could really clearly envision like what was going on, how the play would have been set. It turned out to be a lot more enjoyable than I anticipated. It's a short read and a quick read, and I think like I probably would have enjoyed it a little bit better had it been told in traditional book format, but I actually really want to go see this play now. I'm going to be keeping my eyes out for Fat Ham to come into Las Vegas because I would definitely love to see this now. So those are all the books that I read and how I rated them. My average rating for the month was a 3.74, which is just slightly lower than usual. I'm not sure why, because I feel like I had a lot of 4 and 5 stars, but you know, my favorite book of the month was Bury Your Gaze by Chuck Tingle. I feel like this might have been my favorite just because it caught me so off guard. Like Carmen Maria Machado's books, I expected to love them. Yaa Gyasi's book, I expected to love that. But Bury Your Gaze, I had no idea who Chuck Tingle was. I was expecting something kind of campy and not that deep, but it turned out to be a powerhouse of thematic exploration, but still with that campy, fun horror and that mix of that thriller element. This was a really successful read for me. I don't know that everyone will love it as much as I did, but I found it to be really good fun. My least favorite book of the month was The Fallen Fruit by Shawntelle Madison. Unfortunately, this one really didn't work for me. I think because of the way that this book was described, I had Kindred vibes in my head, and that's such a hard book to live up to. Octavia Butler is such a hard author to live up to, and it just set the wrong expectation for me going into this book. I found myself halfway through it going, what is the point of this? This is so boring and dull. Where is the time travel? And I slogged through it, but it just never really redeemed itself for me. So that's the end of my June wrap-up video. I hope that maybe you found a few books to add to your TBR. If you liked the video, hit the thumbs up, comment down below, and let me know what you thought of my reviews and my ratings. Were there any books that I loved that you hated? Any books that I hated that you loved? Tell me all of the things. And also let me know what you read in June. How did you feel about your reading? How many books did you get to? What was your favorite, your least favorite, all that kind of stuff. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button down below as well as the notification bell so that you never miss a video. And that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.